President Cyril Ramaphosa will attend tomorrow's inauguration of his Zimbabwean counterpart, Emmerson Mnangagwa.
That is despite observers, including the Southern African Development Community and the African Union, raising concerns about irregularities in the election process. Zimbabwe's main opposition party, that is the Citizens Coalition for Change, has called for a rerun of the polls, saying that they were rigged.
The ceremony is expected to take place at the National Stadium in Harare.
Another news tonight, delegates are set to descend on Kenya's capital, Nairobi, from tomorrow. That's for the Africa Climate Summit. But activists are concerned that the meeting will be hijacked by foreign governments, particularly Western governments, and organizations who they say will be pushing an agenda, basically. For more on this, we're joined by the Christian Aid Pan-Africa Senior Advocacy Advisor, Joab Okanda. Joab, a very good evening to you. Grateful for your time tonight. So, is the summit at risk of being basically seized or hijacked by a Western agenda?
Thank you for having me today. The summit was a good opportunity for Africa to set its own climate vision, its own climate and development agenda. But increasingly from the design, from those who've been feeding into it, we've seen a lot of influence by foreign governments, a lot of influence by Western consultancies, McKinsey in particular. And when civil society protested, the involvement and the undue influence that McKinsey was having on the summit agenda, we saw that initially it had actually been listed as the only technical partner, but when civil society protested this, we saw its logo actually being dropped from the websites. And so it tells you who is behind it. When you look at who is funding the summit, when you go to the summit website, you'll see that it's Western governments, it's Western philanthropies that are actually funding the summit itself. The summit agenda itself, John Kerry of the U.S. is actually sitting on 4 different panels, speaking in 4 different sessions that are critical and advancing what actually the Western governments have been pushing for in the climate negotiations.
Sounds like a classic case of who pays the piper calls the tune. So if Western organizations are paying for this gathering, why shouldn't their organizations be involved?
Yes, this is an African summit because it was actually an African Union decision to host this particular summit back in 2019. And we expected that it will be funded by African governments, African institutions. But this is not the case. We've not seen the involvement of African thinkers, African climate negotiators. They've not been involved in the planning of this particular summit. But, it speaks to, what will be driven actually in this particular summit. And the African people are actually protesting this. They'll be expressing this anger tomorrow through a march, and they've decided to organize themselves to have an alternative space where the real African voices can be heard.
And the organizations who've now written to the chairperson of the African Union say in their statement that the risk of the collapse of the event in the 11th hour or at the 11th hour is a possibility. So if it does indeed collapse, where does that leave Africa's climate objectives when you consider that Africans are indeed feeling the pinch and we're seeing the effects of climate change, as scientists are telling us, in or and around the continent, even though in terms of contribution to the causes, Africa is not or has not done as much damage to the climate as the West and other parts of the world?
The paradox of it is that in some of the summit documents that were being produced, particularly by those who are feeding into the process, we saw the language. For example, there was a paragraph that said that currently Africa is actually polluting more than Europe, and basically bringing that responsibility to Africa. We've seen the narrative that is being advanced is that we are in this together. There's no global south, there's no global north, there's no victim here. But Africa is a victim. Our contribution is less than 4% to the global greenhouse gas emissions. There are people who are responsible for this climate crisis. We've seen issues that are pertinent to the African continent, such as climate reparations or the payment of climate debt through loss and damage, not featuring in the summit agenda, and that's problematic for us. it is good not for the talks to collapse the last minute than have a bad deal agreed, that Africa has no control over. But we're still hoping that the summit can still be salvaged, and that whatever declaration comes out of the Africa Climate Summit will actually represent the realities that Africa faces and the interests and priorities of the African people.
Is it impossible, though, Joab, to imagine that the Africans will be in the room in Kenya this week, even though they've not funded, to a large extent, the gathering, will still be able to reach their own conclusions about what the continent needs to do in response to climate change, and that ultimately the outcomes will be theirs?
That is the worrying part of it, and that's the reason that African citizens, African people, are calling out their leaders to actually have a summit that reflects Africa's priorities. There will be Africans in the room, yes, but to what extent they have influence over the final outcomes is yet to be seen. We hope that our leaders can listen to the people, can put the continent first, and that they can prioritize the interests of the African people before the interests of global corporates.
And NGOs, or the non-governmental sector activists, are those who are speaking out against this on the continent. Do they enjoy the support of governments on the continent? Will they have countries that support them in what they are asking for tomorrow?
We've seen a lot of questions being raised by governments. Actually, 2 weeks ago, there was the African Ministers of Environment meeting in Addis Ababa, and some of the governments, for example, Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire specifically, asked why loss and damage is missing on the agenda. And out of this public outrage, we've actually also seen increased consultations with the African institutions and the African Union in particular. And what we've heard now is that the African Union actually has taken over the drafting of the final declaration that will come out of the summit. We've seen the sudden willingness to engage with civil society, but the extent to which the views of African civil society are being factored in is yet to be seen. We are just seeing that, people are already being denied badges. My colleague went to pick her badge despite getting an email approval of her accreditation. She was told she's not approved. I was there yesterday personally on the queue, and many people were being told, you have not been approved to attend the summit. There was a person in front of me had flown all the way from Gambia, and he was told that his application was not approved, yet he had received an email saying his accreditation has been approved, though eventually he was given a badge. But these are some of the things that are worrying us and that are going to exclude a number of key African voices to be in the room.
So with that in mind then, Joab, at the end of this week, what, in your view, would be a sensible set of outcomes, resolutions for Africa in response to the climate challenges?
Exactly, and we want those resolutions to be African-led, not Western-led.
What would they be?
That's why when we see people like John Kerry, who actually publicly said the U.S. will not be paying for loss and damage, sitting in 4 main sessions, it's a little bit worrying because they will take charge of the conversation, and they will steer the conversation to have a narrative that advances their interests.
Joab Okanda, good to speak to you. Thank you so much for your time on News at Prime tonight.
Thank you so much.